You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NAX. Whether it's for food, fuel, drinks, or snacks, about half the U.S. population shops at a convenience store every day. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is John Eichberger with the Fuels Institute and NAX, and I'm joined here today with my co-host,
Donovan Woods, also with the Fuels Institute, and happy to be here, and again, excited for our guest today.
Yeah, we're going to have a great program today. We have one of the people who have done some research for the Fuels Institute, Tammy Klein with Future Fuel Strategies, is going to be joining us. We're going to be talking about global trends and regulatory developments that are going to affect the fuels and vehicles market, so it's going to be a great conversation. Tammy, welcome to Convenience Matters. We know you are joining us today via Skype. Thank you very much, and how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
We're doing great. We really appreciate you joining us today. Before we get started, can you kind of give our listeners a quick 30 seconds on what Future Fuel Strategies is and why we should be listening to what you have to say to us today?
Oh my gosh, that's the big
No
question.
pressure.
That is the who do you think you are?
Exactly.
Well, I'm me. No, I'm kidding. So my name is Tammy Klein, and my consultancy is Future Fuel Strategies. I've been in the fuels industry for more than 20 years, 20 years in the gray hairs that I frequently color out. And I focus on the intersection of fuels policy, fuels market developments, and also fuels technology. So the primary markets I'm focused in are the U.S. and Europe, also to some extent India and China, and some of the more important or more where more things are happening in the emerging world, and really looking at market trends. So I've got connections all across the spectrum, from NGOs and governments to the oil and refining industry to the car companies. And the idea is to really, use that to paint the best picture for clients about, emerging trends, things that they need to know about, and why it's important for their business. So that's a little bit of the background. And I really, when I went out on my own, I really wanted to really bring that all together to really benefit clients. So that's a little bit about what I'm about.
And Donovan, Tammy and I have known each other, 15, 17 years, something like that, quite a while. And
yes.
We reached out to her because one of the reasons we're so focused on global stuff is the fuels industry looks at this, and we know that the auto industry and the fuels industry are global markets. You cannot look at one market, one national market in a vacuum, despite what some protectionist policy makers might want to say. You have to understand what's happening over in Europe, over in Asia, even in Latin America. And if you really want to think ahead, what's going on in Africa, to understand where the auto industry is going, what the fuels market is all about.
So, Tammy, quick question for you, because when John says that, it makes me think, is there a particular country that you would say is the leader that other countries kind of fall in line behind? Are we following China? Is it the U.S.? Is it Germany? Because I hear a lot of things that are going on now that sound strange to me, just being, a 40-year-old guy that knows certain fuels that have always been around in my lifetime. And I hear things being banned, like by 2030, we're going to get rid of diesel in the UK. It'll never exist again. I don't know if that's really going to happen, but is there some place that we look to as kind of the trend setter?
Well, I think it kind of depends on the issue. And to go back to what John was saying, I think that's really what you're saying is really, really important because, I do notice that a lot of folks, here in the U.S., they're really focused on U.S. issues. And, some of those folks are, it's very much on, the renewable fuel standard. And it's like, if it ain't the renewable fuel standard and it ain't CAFE, don't talk to me. And I get that. And that's really, really important. Obviously those two regulations, but there is a larger picture, and I do feel like it's kind of being missed by some of the market players in this country, and then conversely, market players, in other countries. But to answer your question, Donovan, I think that it really depends on what the actual issue is. So, for example, the first thing that came to my mind in terms of leaders, when it comes to electrification or EVs, frankly, I would have to say it's China. And I think China is really driving, electrification. And I think that, when we talk about, it's going to be 50% of electric vehicles by 2040, or, some of the forecasts that you see from Bloomberg, New Energy Finance, and others, I think that, maybe that's true and maybe that's not true, but the locus of that growth, the big percentage of that growth, whatever it's going to be, is going to come from China, because, they're investing, investing in the technology. They're going out and securing, cobalt and lithium supplies. They are, have developed a new energy vehicle policy to essentially, facilitate the growth of the market. They have a larger passenger car vehicle market than we do. We have 6 million passenger cars. They have 24 million. And the growth is going to be astronomical over the next few years. And they have, air pollution, climate change, national security drivers that are pushing them toward that. So, when we look at electrification and we look in that lens, I would say it's China. When we look at, biofuels, for example, or let's say low carbon fuels, I would say, the leader in my mind is the United States. And frankly, a lot of that is California and what they've done with the low carbon fuel standard. They've set a technology neutral, or relatively technology neutral. That might be arguable in some people's eyes, but arguably technology neutral, regulation to that has facilitated the growth of all kinds of different fuels that are in the market now. And I remember when working on the LCFS and doing fuels projections a number of years ago, and in this year, I remember that we projected that the LCFS was not going to be, met, and that, and then through the life of the original program, and then what happened? I mean, we began to see like biomethane, or renewable natural gas, as it's called. We began to see higher volumes of renewable diesel. We began to see more and more biodiesel coming into the market. We began to see a little bit of electricity, so it's interesting to see, how that's evolved. So I think, the market leader depends on, what the issue is. When you talk about car bans, the last thing I'll say about that is, we are seeing that coming out of Europe a lot. And, a lot of that is about air pollution. Some of it is about climate change. And some of it is really, consumer and local government anger about what's happened with Dieselgate. So that's a big response there. And you're seeing these bans, and a lot of them are taking place in Europe. So I guess in one sense, you could call them the leader there.
So that's great. And in 2017, we published a report called Global Initiatives that you drafted for us. And in there, you outline a lot of the initiatives being done throughout the globe on car bans, on biofuels, on a whole bunch of other initiatives. But what I found most interesting behind that, because we hear these announcements, UK and France want to go ICE, liquid fuels, or petroleum free by 2040. Germany's done similar announcements, California, China, India, all these announcements to make these dramatic changes. You start thinking, okay, what are these governments doing? What are they really trying to do? And you actually looked in that report at some statistics related to economic performance, public health, deaths caused by air pollution. There are real underlying motivations that are driving policymakers to take decisions that may seem a little extreme, but can you kind of walk us through what are the real motivating factors that are causing governments to be reaching for so many different approaches to reduce the use of petroleum or to change the transportation sector in such significant ways that we're seeing in the news?
So one issue is the Dieselgate issue. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, it is really ironic because in this country, I mean, if you ask average consumers, it's like, oh yeah, Volkswagen, okay, whatever. Diesel's not a big factor in the passenger car market or light duty vehicle market here, and that's one reason. But the interesting thing is that when Volkswagen got hit in the United States, I mean, it got hit. $20 billion. People went to jail. Their investigations are ongoing with some of the other car companies. I mean, it's really, really serious. And consumers really aren't necessarily tuned into that. In Europe, it was the complete opposite case where the countries involved, in particular Germany, people would say, protected their car industry at the expense of the people. So there is a sort of like a social justice, environmental justice issue that's connected into Dieselgate, which I think really is a factor here. One issue is, two other big issues are, air pollution, which you talk about. Air pollution is getting worse. The big issues for some of these major cities in Europe is nitrogen oxides or nitrogen dioxide in particular, and also particulate matter. It is a serious, serious health concern. And I notice, what has changed over the last 10 years or so is, or maybe actually not even 10 years, maybe actually the last few years, is there's more and more information coming out to consumers in the public domain about the health impacts of air pollution. So that's another factor where people are beginning to, and it's really happening a lot in Europe, I think, where people are looking at their cars and they're looking at the congestion and they're looking at the traffic and they're going, am I, or my family or my children, going to be negatively impacted. So that's a serious thing. So Europe, from the climate change perspective, Europe is really, really interested in being a leader on climate change, upholding and implementing the Paris Agreement. And that's a factor also. But I think if you look at how the car market is going to grow, and I would agree that the locus of the growth is going to be in Asia and to some extent Africa, but there will be some growth in Europe as well. So with all these people, we've talked about urbanization before, with all of these people coming into the cities and cities growing, people, cities and national level governments, state level governments, national level governments realize they simply can't handle the cars anymore. So all of these factors are kind of, driving this issue. But I also think, for some of these countries that are doing the bans, I would say again, I think it's a competitiveness issue. I mean, some of these countries or their auto industries, want to play in China, but they also want to challenge China's primacy, I guess you could say, in the electric vehicle market. So it's all of these factors, sort of working together.
Well, Tammy, you mentioned change and you mentioned some of these countries and you gave them by name. The word that comes to mind to me, well, first of all, let me go back. You've mentioned this word several times in your answers. Is it locust? And in terms of the insect and just how they swarm, is that the term you're using? I like that.
Kind of feels that way with all these policies coming at us.
Well, I said locust, but if you prefer locust.
No, locust is, that's perfect. Just want to make sure I got that. Okay. All right. Now I have the visual.
I'm getting these like grapes of wrath dust bowl in my mind now, but it is kind of like, it's raining locusts. And I think that's part of my job. And what I'm trying to do for clients is to, sort of bring that all together and also look at what's real and what's not, because there's a lot of stuff in the media that is, it's easy to be in the echo chamber and sort of, kind of get lost in, car bans. And, I know one of the things that John and I have talked about is, well, is it, does it cover hybrids? Does it cover, you start digging a little bit deeply and, on these issues, these national car bans. And it's like, there's a lot of vagueness there, which I think is really telling about, it's kind of like we're saying and we're doing the thing that's popular to kind of respond to the public, outcry. But, do we really know what these governments are going to do by 2030 or 2040? I would submit no. And actually, India is the first one. Government officials in India, and I actually verified this with some friends of mine in India who told me, yeah, we're not going to meet that that phase out date for electric vehicles, which I'm sure is probably not a surprise to many of your listeners. So,
and I think that's a key thing. You and I talk about this on stage and together and in private meetings. When you read headlines and you react to headlines, you're missing the story. There's so much underneath those. And then you also have to think about these timelines. Mm-hmm. So let's take UK, France, India, and China as examples. All have declared they want to get out of internal combustion engines, out of petroleum, go to electrification by 2030, 2040. How many governments are going to change hands between now and the target they've set? UK, France, probably quite a few. China, probably not going to happen. They're probably on the same government between now and in 2040. And so you start thinking about, okay, which policies may have the broadest implication for the global market? And I think, you identified China early on. I think absolutely. China, if they want to go all electric by 2040 of new cars sold, they can do that. They have a parochial interest in that they're developing most of the batteries for the industry. They have a command and control economy where if they want to make it happen, they can. They have 32% share of all light-duty vehicles sold globally in 2016. And combined with India, OPEC projects that by 2040, I think it is, they'll have 40% of global GDP.
Yeah, 40%. Can you imagine? I mean, it is, when you start looking and reading and sort of understanding some of the statistics about the rise or the continual rise of China, you're like, it is astonishing.
Which tail's wagging which dog? And, the U.S. likes to think that it has the primacy in terms of economic power in the market. But I think, Tammy, Donovan mentioned, you talk to people in the U.S., we're talking about RFS, we're talking about CAFE, we don't really think about anything else. If they're not paying attention to China, the implications of China to the U.S. market long term, if China continues down this path, could be extraordinarily powerful.
Yes. And it's no accident also that, and this is why I think from a larger, broader policy perspective, I do think it was a huge, huge mistake to announce the withdrawal of the Paris Agreement, although, there's lots of technicalities and we're not going anywhere till 2020 anyway. But to cede publicly leadership in that area just means that, China, it will, sort of cement China's ascendancy in that area. And that will allow it to kind of, I think when we filter it down into the fuels and vehicles market, there might be a lot more exertion of pressure there than I think the industry is currently thinking about. And, and I think it's just, a huge mistake. I mean, I talked to some folks in the fuels industry here. And again, they are just, it's out there, and I think there's sort of an attitude as well that, it's, again, it's not only out there, but, that the U.S., political structure or administration, will sort of, help them through that. And it's like, I think it might be bigger than that. So, it's really important to sort of begin to get a handle, on these issues and to look outside what's going on just in your own backyard. Although what's happening in your backyard, I acknowledge, is very important as well.
So, Tammy, the publication that you wrote for us is entitled Global Initiatives, Assessing Current and Future Global Initiatives on Fuels and Vehicles. Our audience is primarily fuel retailers, but we also touch into the entire transportation sector that listens to this program. What 2 points, if someone were to pick this up, since it's a 40-page, approximately 40-page document, what 2 things could you pinpoint and say, these are the things you want to look for or what you'll learn from this document?
Well, I think the two big things that you'll learn is really what's going on with the drivers that we talked a little bit about during the podcast. I think it's really important to understand the context of what's happening there. And 2, a real quick, easy read and view of the fuels initiatives that are going on out there. A snapshot of biofuels, fuel economy, the car ban issue, where we stand with desulfurization, in gasoline and diesel, and emission standards, sort of what's been happening on the conventional side. So it's a real quick, easy sort of snapshot. And I would also say, I think it's also important to understand, some of the players that are involved in this. And I think that's where I think there's another disconnect is, we're sort of doing our thing, and then there's sort of the NGO that are, interacting, sort of at these supranational levels, so UN, and those two pieces don't seem to be connected. But I think it's important to know a little bit about who those players are and why they're doing what they're doing. So maybe there's three things. Sorry.
I think that last point, ties in so closely to what the Fuels Institute is all about, Donovan. A lot of times I say, individually we may be experts at what we do, but if we don't get up from our desks and look around a little bit what's going on in the market, we're going to miss out on so many opportunities and preparing for challenges. And that extends to the global market. If you're in the transportation world and you are not aware of what might be happening in China or in Europe or on the global scale in terms of policies that are looking to change the transportation market going forward, you're missing out on a lot. So Tammy, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you listening, her report is available at fuelsinstitute.org/research. Check it out. It's free for download. And Tammy, if people want to get more information about future fuel strategies, where can they go?
They can go to my website, which is www.futurefuelstrategies.com. And
I encourage everybody out there to do that and follow her on LinkedIn, because she posts some great stuff that keeps us informed of what's going on. So Tammy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks
and
for having me.
Everybody out there, thank you for joining us on Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in conjunction with Human Factor Media. For more information, visit convenience.org.